6 years ago, I flew over the Atlantic to South Africa for my first ever safari. I've always had a fascination with Africa and the wildlife of the Serengeti, one that actually stems from being obsessed with the Lion King when I was a kid. I had that Elton John soundtrack on cassette too. I used to annoy my mom so much by belting out Circle of Life every time we drove anywhere. Over time though, that simple love for Simba and his friends evolved and matured, and soon I was researching books on Maasai culture. It got to the point where I was fixated on the idea of traveling to Africa. While my sorority sisters talked about visiting the beaches of Bali or the Bahamas after they graduated, my heart was dead set on the Serengeti. It took me a few years to be able to afford the flights, accommodation, and in-country transportation, but eventually I had a good enough job and I had enough in my bank account to be able to afford my dream trip. It was every bit as amazing as I'd imagined it would be. I spent a whole week on various jeep safaris, hanging out of a 4x4 with a pair of binoculars, and let me tell you, even at a distance, just knowing you're looking at an actual lion is a serious adrenaline rush. On one of those safaris, a nice Canadian guy mentioned how incredible an experience it was, but lamented that he couldn't get just a little bit closer to some of the wildlife. Our guide reminded us that even at 200 meters away, some of the wildlife we were admiring could close the distance in a matter of seconds. It was every bit as humbling as I expected. Like, I've never felt quite so vulnerable in all my life, even in the relatively safe confines of the various jeeps I was traveling in. That feeling was nothing, though, compared to what I felt when I decided to take a very different kind of safari. I first started properly considering an air safari after I landed in Johannesburg and began to see various commercials for them. I'd never really been interested until I spoke to someone on one of my jeep safaris that talked about air tours like they were God's gift to naturalists. According to her, air safaris were by far the best way to observe the wildlife. She'd choose that every time if she could only afford it. Apparently, the animals don't react in quite the same way to the buzzing of an overhead aircraft as they do to a loud, clearly visible jeep. She also mentioned that the best way to get unfettered views of the animals acting completely naturally was to do an air safari. That settled it for me. It didn't matter if it'd take a chunk out of my budget. I needed to get on that air safari to experience the exact same thing these people had. I ended up exchanging emails with a representative from one particular company. They promised me a very extensive tour at a very reasonable price. A few $1,000s later, I was meeting up with a bush pilot on this little airstrip right in the middle of nowhere. I was staring at the single-engine propeller plane we'd be flying around the Serengeti. The beat-up old thing looked like it'd be at least 20 or 30 years old. The pilot assured me, though, that she was the most reliable aircraft in their inventory, and she'd never failed him yet. I was a little bit apprehensive, but since he seemed so confident in the plane's abilities, I saw no reason to disbelieve him. After all, if he didn't think it was safe, surely he'd be the first person to refuse to fly, right? So, with that in mind, I climbed into the passenger side of the prop plane, and off we went into the skies. At first, it was everything I'd hoped for and more. The plane flew low and slow enough for us to get some frankly incredible views of the wildlife. I was actually amazed they didn't react more to some big metal bird flying over their heads. Only the younger animals in each herd seemed to pay any attention to us. All the while, the moms continued to graze like, "Chill, we see these things all the time." Sometimes we'd fly up just a little higher, then lean into a gentle turn that allowed us to circle any herd I took an interest in, giving me a full bird's eye view. I'll admit, it was a little less personal than the jeep safaris. Didn't quite have the same adrenaline hit. But little did I know, I was about to get a lifetime's worth of adrenaline in just a few minutes. After 20 minutes into the flight, we were circling over a herd of elephants, with the steady drone of the plane's engine buzzing in our ears. And then suddenly, the buzzing stopped altogether. It didn't just stop dead either. It was a stuttering, rattling sound as the engine tried to keep itself going for a moment, and then just gave out altogether. I looked over at the pilot, completely baffled, but he waved away my concerns while thumbing the plane's ignition, making out like it happened all the time and this was nothing to worry about. I've stalled my car in traffic before, so I figured what we were going through was the aviation equivalent of just that or something. Irritating at best, scary at worst, but still nothing to actually worry about. Yet as I was waiting for the plane's engine to whir back into life from the pilot's repeated attempts to restart it, it started to dawn on me that this wasn't some run-of-the-mill mechanical problem. The engine had completely died and was not coming back to life. That horrifying fact became obvious once the pilot stopped trying to restart the engine. I don't even know how I managed to avoid a complete mental breakdown. The pilot turned to me and said, "We're gonna have to land. We're going to crash." I remember wanting to ask him if we were going to die, but the words wouldn't leave my mouth. I stayed quiet as the pilot walked me through what we would need to do. "It's gonna be fine, don't worry. But this is gonna be a bit of a bumpy landing, okay?" I couldn't say it at the time, but I was convinced this would be the end. When I realized that, a weird feeling of calm came over me. It was like there was no point worrying about something I was doomed to face. We were going down, and there was nothing I could do about it other than brace for impact. The only thing I could think as we began to drop altitude was hoping the end would be quick and we wouldn't have to burn to death before vultures devoured us or something. At 200 feet, I was concentrating on my breathing, trying to keep calm as the trees and foliage grew bigger and bigger at a fast rate. At 100 feet, I began shaking, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. It was less nervous shaking and more terrified full-body vibration. I turned to the pilot to say something, and I remember him just saying, "Shut up and let me think, woman!" It was the kind of comment that would have me clapping back in a normal situation, but in this dead-engine prop plane, I decided to just take it at the chin. At 50 feet, the pilot screamed to hold on. The plane's nose tilted down slightly, and he began to bring us in for the emergency landing. I just remember gripping onto this little handle so tightly. I couldn't bear to watch, so I shut my eyes and hoped for the best. Wham! We hit the dirt hard, but instead of rolling over and crashing, I could feel the landing gear of the plane rumbling against the earth. The plane was shaking like a leaf, and I was convinced it was about to shatter apart. I could hear the pilot shouting, come on, you can do it!" as he talked to the plane. Then, out of nowhere, he started whooping and hollering in celebration. It didn't feel like we were safe, but evidently we were no longer going to explode into a ball of flame or something. When we finally came to a shaky stop, the pilot started laughing maniacally, kissing the dash of the plane. "I told you she hadn't let me down yet." I was in complete shock. I was still shaking, but I turned to the pilot, high-fiving him and telling him he was the man. It was the most intense feeling of my entire life, and one I'll never forget. We were pretty banged up. I had some bruises, but we were otherwise okay. We weren't quite out of trouble yet, though. Once the euphoria died down, we realized we were stranded in the middle of the Serengeti, and our crash had attracted an awful lot of attention. Most animals would have run a mile to get away from the big metal bird that came falling out of the sky, but not all of them. Some of them were attracted to the chaos and destruction, and it led to my closest encounter with any animal in all of Africa. We were quite easily able to relay our coordinates to the rescue team, and the pilot had a few flares he could use to throw on the ground if it got dark. It wasn't like we were going to be stuck there for eternity, but even the 90 minutes we had to wait seemed like forever. We were totally exposed to all of the wildlife surrounding us. We were totally exposed to all the wildlife surrounding us. We got kind of lucky in the end, I think, but we still had a rather close encounter that scared the life out of me. When you think of the scariest animals in Africa, what do you think? Lions, hippos, snakes, spiders? I doubt many people's first answer would be hyenas, but you can bet your butt that was my answer, after a pack of them wandered within just 50 feet and started to surround us. People say they laugh, right? The sound that they make is kind of like a person laughing. Let me tell you, once you hear that sound with your own ears, it sounds nothing like laughter. I remember jumping back in the cockpit of the crashed plane. The pilot was taking a nap, but woke up to show me the pistol we kept in the same place as the flares. "If they come any closer, give them a fright, alright?" I tried to relax, but it was hard with a gang of baying hyenas a few feet away. If there ever was a clear sign that bush pilot was completely insane, it was this. I still owed him my life though, so I didn't say squat to him. Not long after, I heard the distinct sound of an engine in the distance, and the plane's radio buzzed to life. The rescue team, having driven as fast as they could for 100 miles to reach us. I'd never been so happy to see another human being in my whole life. They drove us back to civilization, and I ate the best meal I've ever had, with the pilot at a little roadside diner. He asked for 2 orders of bunny chow, which turned out to be an entire loaf of bread stuffed with curry. As it turned out, that and several beers are exactly what a person needs after surviving a plane crash in the middle of Africa. Back in 2004, my wife and I decided we couldn't face freezing our bits off for yet another British winter, and started looking for a much more tropical location to spend that festive period. We were working on a bit of a budget, and couldn't quite afford the Thai or Vietnamese beaches we'd had our hearts set on, but after a bit of searching, we came across this lovely little beachside bed and breakfast in a little town called Galle, on the southwestern coast of Sri Lanka. It was definitely priced as a budget hotel, but the photos the owners had taken showed it to be a quaint, clean, and beautiful little place. Once my wife was taken with it, I had very little choice on the matter anyway, so I made us a booking. The food was amazing, the people were welcoming, and the beaches were everything we could have hoped for. Come Christmas Day, we had the most unusual Christmas dinner of our lives, sharing a veritable banquet of different dals and curries at a local restaurant. It was so good that neither of us missed the pigs in blankets that year. I'm sure most of you will agree that's really saying something. We finished off with a few drinks on the beach, stopping every so often to giggle at how surreal it all was that we were here sunbathing on Christmas Day. Then, once we were drowsy enough, we headed off to bed for an early night. The next morning was even better. No hangovers, no dodgy leftovers to work through, no going down to the local park in the freezing cold to pretend that a brisk Boxing Day walk is anything but absolute balls. Just sun, sea, and sandy beaches for 5 more days. Me and the wife replaced the horrid Boxing Day park walk with drinks and nibbles in a beachside cafe. Nibbling on dips and wondering how we were going to readjust to life back in the UK again. I mean, it had been literally paradise for almost a full fortnight. We could have never probably guessed in that moment that our festive little Asian trip would turn out to be the biggest mistake of our lives. We soon learned that any dream day can turn into a living nightmare in a matter of minutes. So we're just sitting there in this open-air restaurant, holding hands, enjoying the lovely rhythmic sound of the waves gently breaking against the beach. When suddenly, it stopped. We heard a big rush of water as the water was pulled back away from the shore, but no crash followed. Me and my wife watched as the water crept further and further back away from the shore. And I don't mean like a few feet or something. It kept going and going until we could barely even see the edge anymore. There was only wet sand as far as the eye could see. I distinctly remember the moment I saw these tiny specks on the wet sand in the distance, and how it almost looked like they were jumping up and down. And then I realized that's exactly what they were doing. These were fish that had been swimming in the shallows when the water had just disappeared. Now they were flapping around in the sand and gasping for breath. I turned to see the young waitress standing behind us. I asked her what was happening, but her face told me all I needed to know. She was gawking even harder than we were, and had obviously never seen anything like this in her life. Next thing I know, there were people sprinting out onto the wet sand with plastic bags, scooping up the fish into them before moving on to the next poor flounder or whatever. It was actually quite amusing for a moment, thinking it must have been the easiest morning's fishing any of them had ever experienced. But in the next moment, I heard this absolute roar of a shout coming from down on the beach. An older man was screaming something to the lads out scooping up fish. He turned and started shouting with his hands cupped around his mouth, like he was trying to announce something serious to everyone. I turned to the waitress to ask her what he was saying, but by that time her dad had showed up and had this horrified look on his face. I could tell he was looking out to the sea, so I turned to see just what it was he was looking at. That's when I saw the water was starting to come back, only it wasn't returning as gently as it had gone away. It was getting faster and faster, the wave getting bigger and bigger. "Sir, ma'am, come upstairs right now," I remember the owner saying very suddenly. "There's a big wave coming. We have to get upstairs now." The cafe was basically a big hollowed-out concrete block, so I was confident we would indeed be safe if we went upstairs where there was another open-air dining area. The only trouble was getting everyone up there. The owner's elderly mother was confined to a wheelchair. I didn't actually see her at first. She was in another room when we all started to move. I was halfway up the stairs already by the time I saw the owner desperately trying to pull her up from the bottom. It was one of the most horrifying moments of my life. I could see the man trying to pull her up the stairs backwards in the wheelchair, but it was clear he didn't have the strength to do it on his own. I basically pushed my wife up the stairs, then forced my way back down towards where the owner was struggling. I grabbed one handle and he grabbed the other, but that wasn't working either. We actually tried to carry the whole thing by grabbing the wheel spokes, but that still wasn't working. The whole time I could hear the wave getting closer and closer. I could hear my wife on the top floor screaming, "Oh my God," as it was getting nearer to the building. Then it struck. We didn't have the owner's mom up as high as we needed. All this water and debris came crashing over us. It was pure chaos for a second. I grabbed onto the banister. All of a sudden, the water level dropped a bit, but it was still rushing past us. This let me see that I'd gotten a hold of the owner's arm, while he had a hold of his mom's hands. The wheelchair had been swept away. It was there one moment, and gone the next. Dragged away by what turned out to be a 15-foot-high tsunami. I'm sorry if this writing takes a turn at this point. Remembering it is really painful, and I'm sure you'll understand why in a moment. I was pulling up with all my might, trying to keep the owner and by proxy his mom from being washed away. They were too heavy for me to drag out of the water, and I was struggling to hold on myself. I was terrified I was going to lose my grip, which would mean not only would I die, but they would die too. I can't even express how ashamed I am to say this, but there was a moment I thought about just letting go. The kind of terror I felt in that moment, I'd never experienced anything like that in my life. It was like something else just took over, a screw everyone but me kind of attitude that placed my life above all else. But even in that moment, I knew I couldn't let go. If I lost grip on them, if they got ripped away from me, that was different. But for me to let go seemed like murder for me to go through with it. The next thing I knew, I was snapped out of that horrible moment by screaming from the owner and his mom. I didn't have a clue what they were saying. I'm choking up as I'm writing this. The owner suddenly let go of his mom's hand. I thought she might have slipped or something, but the way he turned so purposefully and ran back up the stairs, I knew he'd just let her go. I was stunned. I didn't know what to do, so I followed him up the stairs to the safety of the top floor. I felt my wife hug me before she burst into tears. It hadn't occurred to me, but because she hadn't been able to see what I was doing, she thought I'd been washed away the whole time. She was crying and screaming at me. I swear I wanted to tell her what just happened, but I just couldn't. Instead, I looked over the edge of the open-top dining area and gasped at the utter destruction below us. The entire landscape had been transformed, almost unrecognizable. The water kept going and going inland, never slowing down and never stopping. I remember the moment I realized it could have been happening to the entire island. Miles and miles of coastline, completely and utterly destroyed in a few moments. Yet although it was bad enough when the water was coming in, it was even worse when the tide dragged it back out again. All that death and destruction that was caused bulldozing its way inland was pulled back past us as the wave returned to the ocean. I saw so many bodies I lost count. Every other second I saw a patch of pink or brown floating on the surface, a streak of color from someone's clothing. So many dead people, so many who didn't see it coming. But the hardest part for me to bear was yet to come. When the majority of the danger had passed by, there was just stagnant water on the floor below us. the owner and one of his sons ventured downstairs to bring up what little food and water they could salvage from the kitchen. We knew the rescue wouldn't be quick, and the people were already working their way through the mess outside, pulling out dead bodies and survivors alike. Me and my wife pitched in as best as we could, but the fact remained there just wasn't much we could do, other than try to comfort the handful of people with us. That night, none of us could sleep, even with the free beer that the owner had given us. So when I saw him smoking a cigarette in the darkness all on his own, I thought I should give him a bit of company. I hadn't smoked since I first tried in college, but that night I asked him for a cigarette. Out of nowhere, he said to me, "I didn't want to let her go." I didn't even really know what to say. I knew he was referring to his mom, but I didn't know if he was just trying to rationalize or what, so I nodded. He went on to tell me that his mom had told him to let her go. She knew I wasn't strong enough to pull them both in, and she also knew it wouldn't be long before we'd all be dragged off. So she sacrificed herself for us. The owner told me their little exchange went something like this. "Let me go." "No, you'll drown. If you don't let me go, we'll all die." "Son, I've had a long life, and I've had a good life. You've been a good son, and you've made me very proud. But your family, you need to take care of them, so do as I tell you." He couldn't bring himself to say goodbye, so he just let her go, then turned and went to look after his family, just like his mom had told him to. This all happened 16 years ago, and I still can't talk or think about it without tearing up every time. I can't even imagine being in that position. Just knowing it happened was completely traumatizing. Only God knows how the man dealt with it himself. I think that's why this has been so helpful to type up. I can't really talk to anyone about what happened that day, besides my wife, anyway. They either get frustrated or they don't understand. If they ask too many questions, I start thinking about the owner's mom again. I choke up and then there's no more talking at all. I think to an extent, the trauma just kind of becomes part of you. It doesn't hurt anyone, it's not debilitating, but it's always there, like the scar left behind after a deep wound. When I was about 16, I needed to get a job. I was out of high school and living with my parents who were driving me insane. I needed to get out. I was applying for jobs everywhere I could find. I would walk into a store and immediately ask if they were hiring. I didn't really care where I worked. I just needed the money to get out of my current living situation. The local grocery store was having a mass hire job fair type deal on a specific day and time. I woke up early, got ready, and went. Everyone looking to get a job had to stand in a line and wait to be interviewed. No big deal. I just fumbled with my phone while I waited. The guy in front of me was standing sideways, so he could easily face me and anyone behind me. He continually asked me questions like, "Is this your first job? How old are you? How far would you have to drive to get to work here?" After the last one, I sarcastically told him I didn't know he was the person that was supposed to interview me. I thought he got the point because he stopped talking to me soon after. We got further up in line, and finally he was being interviewed in the little office. It was really just a set of tall pieces of cardboard that gave the illusion of privacy during your interview. It was set up right in front of the grocery store too, so anyone walking outside could see you during it. I was getting nervous because I really wanted the job. When he got done and came out, he said, "Hope you get the job, cutie. I'd love to see more of you." He walked past me. If it weren't for the interview coming up, I probably would have told him to get lost. Anyway, I get into the makeshift cubicle or whatever. The guy hands me some papers and tells me to fill them out. I do so and hand them back to him when I get done. When I lifted my head up, I saw behind the man interviewing me was that same creep from before, standing a little bit away trying to hide and watching me during my interview. I had already been reasonably anxious before, but now I was starting to really worry. I tried my best to make it through without looking at him and answer the questions I was being asked. Occasional glances toward that man, though, rewarded me with witnessing the creep groping the glass, having his hand down his pants, and jerking off. Finally, he began to take pictures of me with his phone. I was ready to call the cops as soon as I got out of there, if he was still around. When my interview was wrapping up, I was given some pamphlets and a gift card for a few bucks off groceries. I shook hands with the interviewer, and when I looked back at the window, the man was no longer there. Relief washed over me. I went to leave, and hoped to God I didn't just fuck up my interview because of that distraction. I walked through the grocery store back to the door I'd entered in, and shortly after walking outside, I saw the man leaning up against the wall, waiting for me. I pulled my keys out and put them in between my knuckles like I was taught to do at a young age. My other hand went straight to my pocket, grabbing hold of my phone. I started to walk towards my car. As I walked past him, he stepped to walk beside me. "So, how'd it go?" "You're really too cute to be working at a grocery store, you know. You'd make a lot more money without even having to leave your house if you just went online." It was disgusting, but I said nothing. "Oh, so you're gonna be like that, huh? Not gonna say anything to me? Probably a good idea, 'cause if you open that mouth of yours, I'd be tempted to stick my—" I cut him off by swinging around towards him and punching him in the throat with my key fist. Unfortunately, my grip on my keys weren't tight enough, and they fell out of my hand on impact. That was enough to shut him up though and get him choking. I grabbed my keys off the ground and sprinted for my car. He was following after me, calling me a fucking bitch and other vulgarities I can't remember. I jumped into my car and locked it just in time as he began to slam his fists on my driver's side window. I was shaking like crazy. I pulled out my phone, and after a few feeble attempts from my shaking hands, I correctly dialed 911. He was pounding on my window, shouting about how I assaulted him, trying to open my doors, walking around to see if any of the doors were unlocked. I tried my best to talk to the dispatcher and tell them where I was at. When he got back to my driver's side door and continued to pound on it and cuss at me, I held my phone up to the window. He could see I'd dialed 911. On that note, his face went white, and he looked around and casually walked away. I waited a bit before telling the dispatcher I thought he was gone. They didn't want to send out a patrol if he'd already left. The dispatcher got the description of the man from me, and told me they'd have someone come out and look at the grocery store's camera footage. They would talk to the guy who interviewed me as well, to see if they could find out who the guy was. I never heard from the man again. And thankfully, to my knowledge, as I frequent this store quite regularly, the man did not get the job. Unfortunately, neither did I. Warning: upsetting content ahead. Where to start with this story? So I work as a veterinary nurse assistant. We get unusual things brought into our clinic, but this one, I just had to share. Today, the 31st of October 2020, was my Saturday to work. I was on reception with the receptionist and vet nurse. Early 9 a.m., we get a call from an elderly man. Says he found a dead cat in his front garden at the time. Looked like its head had been caved in or something. We often get deceased animals brought in as a result of being hit by a car, so we asked him to bring it down to us. Before 10 a.m.-ish, the elderly man came in with a black cat in a plastic bag. We took contact details from the man. Then he told us about how he'd found it and how upset his wife was. Here's where things got creepy though. The cat was in a clear plastic bag. It had no head. It was decapitated. On further inspection, where the cat's head should have been were clean cuts as well. Now, a bit of a background. I live in the UK, and a while back we had a string of mutilated animals being found outside homes and in parks. At that point, the supposed suspect was called the Croydon Cat Killer, or the M25 Cat Killer. The police ruled it out to be foxes, supposedly. I've seen plenty of animals, though, that have been attacked by other animals, and I can say with absolute confidence this was no animal. The whole body, apart from the missing head, was intact. No bites, puncture wounds, broken bones, nothing to suggest the cat had been killed by an animal. It was as if it had been cut clean by a knife. We scanned the poor cat for a microchip and found one. We looked up the details on the microchip system and found the cat's name as well. Lucifer. A black cat named Lucifer found beheaded on Halloween. I wish that wasn't true and I just made it up, but sadly it was not. We tried contacting his owners. Home phone wasn't connecting, so we left a message on the mobile phone number that we'd found Lucifer and to call ASAP. Another disturbing thing was the address where Lucifer was found was 2 streets over from his registered address, and very close by my vet clinic as well. I was very wary when I finished my shift, and waited outside the clinic until my husband was outside to pick me up. It was an unnerving feeling, realizing that whoever did this was still lurking around out there. We alerted the police, RSPCA, and a group called Snarl as well, South Norwood Animal Rescue and Liberty. The lovely old man agreed to be contacted by the police and to help in any way. I've worked alongside animal cruelty and abuse cases, but this was the most chilling, disturbing, and upsetting thing I'd ever encountered. I'm hoping we get good news about this story and find out just who was behind this. I have kind of a weird story to tell. I've only ever told one person, as honestly, I didn't realize how strange the entire situation was until I brought this up to a friend of mine. This happened a few months ago, and at the time I had just recently been fired from my job. I had been working there for several years, and so the abrupt firing caught me by surprise. I thought everything had been going alright for me, but just like that, they told me to pack up my things and leave right away. Honestly, it made me feel pretty bad. Rather than spend some time trying to find another job immediately, I spent a few weeks moping around my house and not doing much of anything. I had lost both the strength and the will to do anything, especially look for a new job. Though at that dark point in my life, one of my close friends tried to help me out. This friend reached out, telling me that a position at one of her other friends' companies had opened up recently. It was nearly the same as the one I'd been fired from, so right away it seemed I'd hit the jackpot. All seemed perfect, though there was still something in my mind saying this was a little bit strange. My friend, who I won't name for privacy's sake, had always been a little bit on the shady side. Maybe they just weren't the most open person to talk to, or maybe they were just simply reserved, but there always seemed to be something a little bit off about them. For the sake of my future, as well as a potential job opportunity though, I put that out of my mind and focused on applying. In just a short time, I'd gotten out of my slump pretty fast, and was preparing for this new job and a new start as well. My friend sent me the phone number of the company, and told me the hours I would be able to call them at. I woke up as early as possible on the day I was going to give them a call, readying myself for the always nerve-wracking interview I was about to have. When the time was right, I called the company, and before I knew it, I was connected to your average phone-answering secretary, it seemed. The fake peppy voice she put on made me feel that I'd had the right number straight away, and I told her the reason I was calling. She was quick to begin asking questions afterward, taking in all my basic information. Name, phone number, just like every other company did as standard procedure. I replied with all the information she was seeking, along with answering a few more filtering personal questions she asked, like what experience I had and any prior jobs I'd had as well. I sat on the call for some time answering her questions before she said she'd gotten all the information she needed out of me. At the end of the call, she informed me that 2 days from then, I could come in for an in-person interview. I remember hanging up the phone and sitting still for a few moments after. I was as happy as I could be. After going through such a tough time unexpectedly, it felt like I was really getting somewhere. It was easy to say I was ecstatic about getting an interview. Thus, I spent the next few days preparing before the day was finally here. I woke up early, got dressed in my finest. A black suit over a button-up shirt underneath, along with a pair of fine dress pants. I went the full 9 yards with everything that morning, as I knew I had to be my best for any interview. I pepped myself up the entire time as well, until I was finally ready to leave. Still though, I was really nervous. I took a few deep breaths before leaving the house. I got into my car and started heading to the address. I remember the drive actually wasn't too far away, only about 10 minutes or so. As I got closer, though, it began to feel as if my destination was hours away. I got closer to the address, and my nerves got even worse. I had been through many interviews before, and the thought of one more shouldn't have made me as nervous as I was. It got the best of me during the car drive, and I was completely caught up in them. Before I even realized, I'd pulled right into a parking space of where my GPS had told me to go. As I parked, I came to my senses and realized where I was. I managed to get even more nervous as I realized this. I wanted to go home and forget about this interview, as I thought about how unexpectedly my last job had ended. Still though, I shook him off and looked at where my GPS had taken me. I stepped out and looked at the building in front of me. Instead of what I assumed was going to be a typical office space or something, there was a gigantic run-down building in front of me. I remember staring at every inch for some time. All the windows were either broken or boarded up completely. The coloring of the bricks was faded as well, and there wasn't even a front door on the place. I began to think that I simply had the wrong address, but my GPS confirmed this seemed to be the correct destination. I even checked the address I'd typed in multiple times. Each time I looked, the numbers were the same and correct. I realized that this really seemed to be the right place. My mind was all over the place in this moment. My nerves about the interview were gone, although in their place was a whole new set of anxiousness. I went closer to the building to inspect it. I had to see for myself that the building was the right one before I decided to leave. As I approached, I was stopped by someone coming out from the side of the building, a man in a reflective high-visibility jacket. "Hey, what are you doing here? This is a construction zone," the man yelled. I was even more confused. I understood what he meant, though, when I walked closer to him and caught a peek around the other side. There was indeed a construction crew with tons of heavy machinery just sitting there. "Oh, sorry, I thought this was the place for my interview. I was looking for so-and-so, but it seems I have the wrong place." No, this is so-and-so, but I don't know what interview you're going to be having here. The building's been abandoned for a few decades," the man said. My face turned to shock, and I got even more of a headache from the situation. "But I called a few days ago. Someone answered and said she was with a company called so-and-so." The man stared at me. "I don't know who's trying to fool you here, but this building did belong to that company back in the day. They haven't been around for a few decades, though. Now get along there. The building's supposed to be demolished today, and my guys have to get back to work," the man said again. I could do nothing but leave. The company seemingly didn't exist anymore. It seemed like I'd been the victim of some sort of cruel prank at the hand of whoever was on the other line. But something put me off. The call had seemed so legitimate. The girl on the other line had certainly fooled me for being a secretary of some company. I didn't think much more of it, though. The man had said the company I was trying to join hadn't existed in that place in decades. Just like that, I was back to square one. No job and no interview. The drive back home was long and silent. It hardly even fazed me just how weird the encounter had been, as all I could think about was now I wasn't even able to have that much to be excited about. I got home and went right back to where I'd started. I holed up in my house for a couple of weeks, not having the motivation to do anything, as I once again found myself in a depressive episode. As more time went by, I slowly healed again, and found the will to look for a job once more. This was several months ago, mind you, and since then I fixed myself even more. I was able to find a new job, much better for my own health than the one I'd been fired from. Over the several months in between this story I just told and now, I'd been so focused on my new job and working hard enough to keep it, that the situation had gone through and slipped my mind entirely. It wasn't up until the point that I told my friend the entire story of what happened to me that I realized just how strange it was. When I informed my friend the number they had given me, I realized it was actually incorrect from the one she'd meant to give me. She apologized a lot after realizing her mistake and ended up giving me the actual phone number, which is actually how I found my current job. The fact of what I had gone through was still up for question. I had accidentally been given a wrong number, but was put through to a seemingly real company. On top of that, I even got told to come in for an interview to a real address, and for a real company that once existed, even if it no longer did. The whole situation is just kind of a big mystery to me. My friend and I threw out many ideas, some that were pretty ordinary like a simple prank call, and some that were farther out. You know, some like how I could have gone through an insane phenomenon like time travel through a phone call or something. Some of the ideas were of course ridiculous, and even now I have no clue what happened to me on that day. This happened to me just a few weeks ago. I've dwelled on telling this story to anyone that wasn't close to me over that time, and now I believe that I'm doing well enough to come out about what happened. I, 24 and female, have been living on my own for several years now. I settled into my own house shortly after finishing college. I hadn't had any major problems with the house so far, and everything seemed to be great all around. On top of that, the neighborhood I settled into was amazing as well. All my neighbors were very lovely, and I was able to interact with all of them and become somewhat close. It seemed like I had found a place I could live in forever. There wasn't a single problem in sight, at least until one of my neighbors that I had grown close to over the time I'd spent in that house moved away one day. At first, my neighbor leaving was nothing more than an unfortunate life event. Sure, I would miss them, but there wasn't much I could do about it, and it wasn't as if something horrific had happened to them and I'd never hear from them again. Them leaving, though, was just the start of the problem, as what was brought in their vacancy was far worse than I could have ever suspected. When my neighbor found a home elsewhere, they had put their house up for sale, and over the coming weeks, many people came and went in and out of the house. First off were the movers, removing everything that my neighbors had told them to before putting them up in their new home. Once everything was out, it was time to sell off the house, which brought in people that were looking to move. Tons of people were moving in and out daily, as it seemed like the area I had moved into was quite the hot commodity. I watched as families, couples, and even rich singles walked in and out of the house every day. Cars lined the street as the same female realtor walked them all through the house one by one. This went on for quite some time. I would go to work when the people began to pour in and look around, and when I came back around the time when it finished up, the last groups were just getting done with their tours. One particular day I came home, and just like any other, people were getting in their cars and leaving as the street cleared out for the day. As I walked up to my front door, though, I realized that the realtor and a viewer were having a conversation on the front lawn. I let them be as they talked, until I noticed that both of their gazes were now fixated upon me. I looked back at them as they waved over to me. Like any normal person would, I gave a polite wave back before going back inside my house. I really didn't think that much about it at the time, but the viewer that I had waved to was a little bit unsettling to look at. Something about them just set me off slightly. I didn't really give it much mind though, especially since I figured I would never see them again. Hundreds of people had viewed the house, and chances of him buying it seemed slim to me. With this thought in my head, I went about my night before going to bed. When I woke up the next morning though, something was different. As I prepared to leave for work, there was no bustle of cars outside the house next door. No group after group going inside and looking around. There was silence. It was nice, but that silence meant something. The house had been sold off, as there was now a sold sticker over the sign on the front lawn. That wasn't much for me to think about for the time being, other than wondering who my new neighbors were going to be. I at least hoped they were going to be up to the standard of my last ones. I went to work, and at the end of the day when I came back home, I had my very first encounter with my new neighbor. I walked inside, enjoying the silence of the house next door. I sat down at my kitchen table, grabbing something to eat from my fridge. When I sat down, I looked over at that house next door and saw someone inside. They were surveying the room they were in before they glanced out their window. I remember the piercing glare they hit me with as the eyes of the man from the other day met my own. Even though he was glaring at me, somehow the look on his face still managed to be quite friendly, and thus I gave a forced smile and a slight wave. I was shocked to see that man from before inside the house now, but that only meant one thing. My new neighbor was him. It made me feel a little bit strange, honestly, but maybe that was just the impression I was getting from him. Didn't want to judge a book by its cover. Besides, he seemed to be really nice. That's what I told myself in my head, at least, as I tried to get that original strange encounter with him out of my mind. Little did I know I would be seeing his gaze a lot more after that first encounter with him, partly because he was going to move in very shortly thereafter. After that day, he was at his new house daily, moving in his stuff with the help of movers and other workers. I went about the next week as if it was any other, with the only difference being that instead of people coming to view the house and it being noisy, there was a man next door moving in being noisy at all hours of the day. On top of that, he always seemed to be gazing at me, his eyes always tracking mine. Each time he would give a friendly wave before going on about his day and continuing what he was doing, as if it had never happened. This went on until just about a week and a half after he had bought the house, as he'd fully moved into it now. I tried to tell myself the man was very friendly, but something about him still put me on edge when I was around him. With nothing else to do, I would welcome him to the neighborhood and go over to his house myself with a small gift. It was a good thing to do as a neighbor in the first place. Without a real plan, I went over next door and introduced myself, as well as scoped out the person I had so many suspicions about. In all honesty, it went perfectly fine. He graciously accepted my gift and introduced himself kindly as my new neighbor. I introduced myself right back. It was such a pleasant, normal interaction that I immediately wrote off all my suspicions of him being anything other than a completely normal guy. Maybe I'd actually be able to get along with him as well as my last neighbors. He didn't seem like someone I'd have to be wary of, at the very least. After introducing myself, the days between us went on even more normally. I saw him a few times. I saw him very little, actually, aside from sometimes when I came or left from work. Even then, all we'd do was wave, say hi, and casually chat for a bit. I slowly saw a change, however, as I began to see my neighbor more and more frequently. It started with him being outside when I came home more and more, to the point where it was almost daily. It wasn't that out of place, I guess, but it still stuck in the back of my mind. Then it turned into seeing him before I left almost every day as well. It didn't stop there either. I began to see him out my window in the early mornings. I would catch him facing the direction of my house before he cracked his signature friendly smile. It got progressively worse, too. I began to see him staring at me out the window more and more. I got more and more creeped out until one event finally broke me. I came home from work one evening, and to my surprise, he was not out in front of his house waiting to wave at me like always. I went inside and decided to do a few things before heading to bed. Ate, watched some TV, waited for a few hours to pass before I felt tired enough to hit the hay. Not before I took my dog out for its nightly walk, though. The weather was just starting to get nicer, and I had been regularly walking him around the neighborhood for about 15 minutes or so each night. It was a nice routine. I grabbed up his leash and the two of us stepped outside. There was little excitement on these walks, as usually everyone was in bed around the time we went out. It was much nicer this way. The silence of the night was something I greatly enjoyed, even if it was only for 15 minutes a day. Eventually, our walk came to an end as we rounded the corner that led back to my house. I remember looking into the house next to mine as I walked past. My neighbor always seemed to be asleep at this time of night, as there were no lights on inside of his house. That stayed the same today, though even with no lights on, I still felt something from the house, as if my neighbor was staring at me somehow, even though all his windows were closed with the curtains drawn in front of them, and there was no visible light inside. I could still feel his piercing gaze. I tried to push that feeling out of my mind. I looked toward my own house and picked up the pace slightly. Eventually, I made it inside. I shut the door behind me in a hurry as I leaned my back against it, staying still for a few moments while recovering myself. I remember panicking hard, having to catch my breath. I quickly did and went on to try and get some sleep. I got all ready for bed, but was stopped in my tracks when I entered my bedroom to finally lay down. Across the way from my room and my neighbor's window, He was standing there, staring into my room as I got ready to lay down. He smiled and waved at me like he always did. I remember panicking and running out of my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I wasted no time running to each other door and making sure they were already locked. I shut every blind and curtain I had on my windows and completely sealed myself in. I wanted to sleep, but fear kept me awake, and I didn't sleep a wink that night. Eventually, the sun shone through the cracks in the blinds, and I could tell it was now morning. The subtle light in the room made me feel a bit safer, although I knew I was not out of the woods yet. With the sunlight creeping in, I calmed myself down. I was composed enough to tell someone what happened. I messaged a group chat with my closest friends and let them know what was going on. A few of them offered to come over immediately or even call the police for me, though I had no actual evidence my neighbor was doing anything of ill intent. Thus, I took one of my friends up on their offer to stay over. He was one of my closest guy friends, and the person I probably trusted most to help me out in this situation. He said he was coming over soon. I spent the time waiting for him to come over by calling my work and letting them know what was going on, and I would be taking the day off that day. A little time passed before I could hear my friend's car outside as he pulled into my driveway. A knock at the front door followed as I went to open it. I made sure the person I was letting in was my friend. I felt some stress lifted off my shoulders as I let him in. We sat down on my couch as I sprawled out on it before passing out almost instantly. The comfort I felt from having someone around made me fall asleep right away, and I was finally able to put my worries out of my mind. I woke late into the night as I got my usual amount of rest and then some. I woke up completely disoriented as well, almost unable to tell where I was. It was one of the best rests I'd had in a while. It was around 8 p.m. when I woke up. My friend told me when I had gotten more oriented, and I thanked him for staying with me while I slept. He wanted to stay for the rest of the night. I took him off on his offer, though I wasn't that tired whatsoever. We stayed up together and watched TV. This went on around an hour or so, before it was time for my nightly walk with the dog. Usually I would get ready to go right away, but tonight I was second-guessing myself on if I should or not. Ultimately, I went against it, much to the dismay of my dog, who didn't seem to be very happy. It was for the best, though. With nothing else to do except go back to watching TV, we did just that. My dog didn't seem to want to sit still, though. He kept on pacing around the house. My dog went on to do this for about 20 minutes, until he started whining repeatedly. It started out quietly at first, but soon picked up until the point where we could no longer ignore him. I went to check on what my dog was whining about. I found him pacing around a room near a window wall, one that he could see out of, as he seemed to direct me toward the window. I got closer, as he began to bark louder and louder. I almost yelled at him for barking so late at night, before I realized the reason he'd been going off the whole time. I crept up towards him, picked him up in my arms, and then I caught a glance out the window at what he'd been barking at. My eyes went wide with surprise, and I felt almost sick as I saw the figure of my new neighbor huddled tight against the wall of my house. He seemed to be waiting for something, as every few moments he poked his head out of his hiding spot. It didn't seem like he'd seen I'd noticed him yet. I immediately ran to get my friend, trying to stay as quietly as possible so as to not alert the man outside. I got to my friend and urged him to come with me to the window. My neighbor was still there when I got back, huddled against the wall and waiting for something. It was then that I realized what he'd been waiting for. The reason I felt him staring at me every night I'd gone out with my dog. He was waiting for me to head down the path back home. I felt sick thinking of what could have happened to me if I had gone out that night. I retreated further into the house as my friend began to video the neighbor outside. He made sure to get his face included as well, clearly showing that he was on my property without permission. We followed up by calling the police and quietly reporting the man waiting outside. We waited for what felt like an eternity before we heard the sirens outside and saw the flashing blue and red lights. We checked back on my neighbor's hiding spot, and we saw he had moved, though we hadn't seen where he'd gone to. The police were still approaching. Then we heard multiple bangs coming from the front door, along with the man yelling. I instantly knew it was the neighbor. I don't want to recite the things he said from the other side of the door. as I've tried tirelessly to push them out of my mind entirely. The banging continued until the sound of other voices could be heard outside. I could tell the police had finally arrived. Sometime after the situation had died down outside, one of the cars could be heard leaving my house, but another remained. Another knock at the door came, this time from a police officer. The officer asked some questions about what was going on. After we told him we'd called and I gave him the rundown of the situation and what happened in the days leading up to this point, I was trembling through it all as I held the fear inside of me from the encounter. After answering all the questions, we showed him the video of the man hiding next to my house, waiting for me. I also told him what I thought was going on. I'm glad the officer took the time to hear everything out that I had to say. He even wrote down most of it before leaving to report what I'd told him. He told me I didn't have to go to the station to give further information if I didn't want to. In the end, I didn't want to. I didn't want there to even be a chance of seeing my neighbor again. I went back inside where I fell asleep quickly on the couch, along with my friend, as he hadn't slept a wink the entire time he'd been with me. We got a nice long rest before we woke up the next morning. Little information came out about what happened until a few days later. We got word he'd been charged with trespassing, an attempt at breaking and entering. They said he would likely get very little jail time for this, but we could still get a restraining order against him. If he ever came close to me again, he'd be charged and sentenced to far more jail time than he was going to be serving now. This put me at ease a little bit. It felt like delayed comfort, as I knew a restraining order could mean very little to someone who didn't care to obey the law. That was, for the most part, my entire story, as at present time, my neighbor still sits behind bars for a little bit. Now, the house next door has picked right back up with what had been happening a few weeks prior. The commotion started once more, as people poured in at the hopes of living there again. I'm kinda sick of the noise they were making daily, but that's not the worst thing for me. All I care about is that hopefully I get a better neighbor next time. This happened in New York City. Years ago when I was a freshman in college, I was out partying one night with some friends. I wasn't drunk or on any hard drugs or anything, but I definitely smoked a blunt or two. Around 3 a.m., we decided to go our separate ways. I got off the train and began my long walk home. I had to take an even longer route home that night too, because some of the train lines happened to be under maintenance. When I got off the train, I realized I would have to walk past the cemetery, and I started to feel a bit uneasy. I wasn't afraid for any particular reason though. It was about 10 blocks and then I'd be home. I always saw trucks lined up on the cemetery blocks, and it being a desolate area, I assumed it was truckers parking their trucks by the cemetery to take naps or sleep before continuing on their routes. Back then, I didn't really give it much thought. A few minutes after getting off the train and starting my walk though, I heard the faint sound of what I guessed to be a car or truck door being shut behind me. I turned around, but in the darkness, I couldn't see anything. I tried to scan my surroundings once quickly. I didn't see anyone ahead of or behind me as far as my eye could see. I kept walking, this time a bit faster, and about a minute later, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I turned around so quick, I swear I could have snapped my own neck. I saw a man walking swiftly just a few feet behind me. When he saw me turn around, he began catcalling me by making kissing noises. I was used to these sorts of things, especially living in New York City. By my house, there was always a line of men on the corner every morning, waiting to be picked up for construction work. Every time I passed them to go to the store, I would get catcalled and harassed. Because of this, I simply ignored the man and kept walking. Definitely faster this time though. Only a few seconds later, he was sprinting to catch me. He was now at my side, speaking to me in Spanish, a language which I don't speak. He grabbed my arm tightly enough to leave bruises and began pulling me towards him. I started screaming and fighting him off. He pushed me up against the cemetery fence. In the midst of this, my heart sunk to the floor. I thought I was about to be ripped or worse. Seconds later, he had me off my feet by both arms, when suddenly his face turned white in the moonlight. A look of terror passed his face as he looked past me into the cemetery, seemingly fixated on something ahead. He let out a blood-curdling scream and let me go. As I dropped to the floor, he was already sprinting across the street and running out of sight, choking on tears and shaking. Beside myself, I picked myself up and ran so fast the last few blocks to my house. I didn't dare to turn and look back into that cemetery. I didn't turn around at all. I didn't stop until I was home. I never took that train or walked past that cemetery again. To be honest, I never told my parents either. I only told a handful of friends over the years, because to this day, I still don't understand exactly what happened. All I know is that something in that cemetery probably saved my life that day. It's taken so long for me to finally be able to tell this story, because whenever I do, people seem to be underwhelmed, I guess. This was a terrifying experience for me. I can only imagine people find it to be so unbelievable it's kind of hard to sympathize with. Anyway, this was 2 years ago in the summer. I had this coworker I was friends with, and he asked me to hang out around 11 p.m. I told him I was busy and had to walk my dog. I really wasn't in the mood to hang out, but he ended up somehow convincing me anyways. So he gets to my house and we drive to this park about 10 minutes away. We sit on the swing set and talk for a while. We ended up talking about some creepy stuff, so I think we kind of spooked ourselves from the content of our conversation naturally. A bit of time later, I suggested we go to a drive-thru. We both got up to leave the park and walked to his car, which was parked on the side of the street. As we were walking, we noticed a man also walking on the sidewalk. We both mentioned to each other how we'd seen him in the park earlier as well. He creeped us out a bit since he seemed to be watching us, but we really didn't think anything else after he went away. If I remember properly, the man was walking past our car down the sidewalk. We were walking straight to get into the car. We were about 6 or so feet away from him when he turned around and started walking straight towards us. My friend hadn't even had the time to unlock his car doors before the man started screaming. "Are you fucking serious?" We had no clue why he'd be yelling at us like this, so we kinda just stood there frozen beside our car doors. I started to jiggle the passenger door and look at my friend. The man started to get closer, so we knew we had to run. I can't explain how our thought process worked in this moment, because we weren't saying anything to each other. Our instincts just kinda both kicked in after the initial shock wore off. My friend ran the same way the man had been walking before he turned around, and I ran the other way. The man chased after my friend. I kinda half jogged, half stayed in one spot, trying to figure out if my friend was about to be killed by this crazy guy or what. I screamed in their direction I was calling the police, but the guy didn't even skip a beat and kept on yelling and rambling into the night. I'm a girl and my friend was a guy, so I think naturally he wanted to get the guy away from me or something. In that moment, I thought my friend was going to be killed, and the man would come back for me after. Keep in mind, we were on a street on one side of the park. There were houses all lined on this street, and not one person called the police or checked to see if we were okay. My flight kicked in, and I ran behind someone's house to hide in their backyard while I called 911. The funny part is, after explaining the situation and how we were being chased by a man saying he was going to kill us both, the 911 operator asked where I was and told me I needed to leave the backyard in case I scared the owners. I was literally hiding so I don't die, but the operator said, "Nah, go back into his line of sight so you're not hiding on someone's private property." Anyway, I heard my friend yell my name. It took me a minute to come out, but I finally did. He told me the man had run off, and the police showed up soon after. They took our statements, but didn't really seem too concerned. He put his searchlight on the cruiser and just drove around the area. Literally after the police had already left, a woman came out of her house and told us she saw the whole thing. Told me the guy was screaming he was going to rear our corpses after he killed us, and she was so scared for us. Oh, thanks. Anyway, that's my story on how we thought we were being chased by a madman who was saying he was going to rear and murder us. We thought other people would care, but nah, they just stayed inside their house and didn't even call the police for us. Please take this as advice to always watch your own back, and never expect other people to have your best interest in mind. Nobody cared about us, and we were teenagers running for our lives in a public park. People are assholes, and most of the time bystanders, making them nearly as bad as the guy that was chasing us. The police didn't seem to give much of a shit either. Private property was more important than my life. If I said Medellin, Colombia, what do you think of? Pre-2015, only a handful of people would have given the answer that's commonplace today. But since that Narcos show was on TV, almost everyone knows what Medellin is famous for now, and that's for being the home of the Medellin cartel, headed up by the one and only Pablo Escobar. These days, that cartel is confined to the history books, but the legacy of their violence lives on in the city, and the countless problems didn't exactly die along with Escobar when the law caught up with him back in '93. It's there in that city that I met a girl named Stephanie while I was traveling around South America. Steph was from Canada, on a similar sort of rolling vacation as I was. There was almost this instant chemistry between us that ended with me asking her out. We drank cheap Colombian beers, compared traveling tattoos. She definitely won with her traditional tippy-tap Filipino tribal piece, and generally just had ourselves a great time. When it came to the end of the night, though, we were put in a rather precarious position. You see, the old legacy of violence and suspicion means that in a city like Medellin, you can't get anywhere without the right credentials. As a result, neither of us were allowed any guests in our respective hostels. We thought on our feet and decided the night was warm enough for us to spend it in one of Medellin's public parks. So we spot what seemed like a nice enough place to lay down. Only, as we're walking over, we see these 4 Colombian guys hanging out on a bench. No reason to be suspicious right away, right? I mean, it was a nice enough night. And the South American idea of a late night is totally different to our own. Not everyone hanging out past midnight is some kind of reprobate or something. I suppose that goes for the States too, but I digress. So me and Steph are sitting there for a few minutes when one of the guys from the bench comes over to talk to us. My Spanish was still embarrassingly dire at that time, but I knew enough to know he was asking for a cigarette. I told him I didn't smoke, but he carried on asking for stuff like money, then other things with words I didn't quite understand. I kept telling him I didn't know what he was saying, but he just wouldn't give up. He kept on talking us, then spit out something mean-sounding in Steph's direction. At that point, I took issue. I have enough Dutch courage to tell him to get fucked before I led Steph off to another spot farther away from them. I'll spare you the finer details of what followed, but needless to say, Steph and I ended up having a little cuddle, shall we say, until we heard and saw something that almost scared us half to death. A police siren and flashing lights, just a few feet away, near the boundary of the park. Steph quickly pulled her dress back on, and we attempted to make ourselves as presentable as possible as the cop car screeched to a stop. 2 guys jumped out, and they came jogging over to us. How they knew we were there, I don't know, but I figured the guy asking for smokes had called them as a kind of screw you for not being generous sort of thing. I was on the verge of a full-on freakout. All I could think of now was how I was going to end up in a Colombian jail, and that would be the end of it for me. Colombia has some of the worst prisons in all of South America, and no offense to our Latin cousins, but that's really saying something. What's worse, I didn't have the money to pay a fine or a bribe, so there was zero chance of me talking my way out of it. Still, I didn't really have much of a choice. The best I could hope for was to pull off a speech skill 100 check, so I got down to it. As this little Colombian cop, I don't even say that to be mean, the guy was literally no bigger than 5'4" or so, was shining his flashlight in my face. I was pouring out a string of bilingual apologetic consciousness. All the cop did was scold us in Spanish, talking so fast I couldn't even understand a word. Steph was welling up with tears at this point, as she too thought she was going to be arrested. All I could do was shut up and let the cop burn off whatever angry energy he had. I prayed he wouldn't just drag us off to jail then and there. I told him I couldn't understand, until he finally calmed down and pulled a smartphone out of his police vest. That's when I saw him pulling up Google Translate, and I knew something wasn't quite right here. If he was here to throw the cuffs on us, surely he'd have already done it, right? So what was he about to type out? I'll never forget what came next, and how I foolishly tried to anticipate his words without stopping to consider the context. The first thing he typed was "these men" and pointed over to where the cigarette guy and his friends had been. I looked over, expecting to see them all looking smug, but no one was there any longer. It dawned on me that they'd beat feet as soon as they'd seen the cops arrive. I was about to say something like, "Yeah, I know they called you, I'm sorry," but the cop cut me off with a little sock puppet hand gesture. I watched him type further. "These men are very dangerous. You need to leave now. They will come back." The cop stopped for a second, like he was trying to find the right word. "They'll come back and they'll violate the girl, you understand?" My chin was dusting the floor at this point. I had no idea we were in that much danger. Right before I could say anything else, the man typed once more. "These people are known to us. They've done things before and they'll do them again." Again, we just nodded, too stunned by how dumb I'd been to really be relieved that we weren't in any trouble. "Don't come back here again during the night, no matter what." He showed us the message and escorted us to a well-lit street nearby. As you can imagine, that whole thing really killed the mood, and even though I walked Steph back to her hostel, there was never any talk of me getting inside to continue where we left off. I saw her a few more times before she moved on to Argentina. And yes, we did conclude some unfinished business, even kept in touch for a while after I returned to the US. But you can bet your bottom dollar I did not go anywhere near any poorly lit places in Medellin for the remainder of my stay. I learned my lesson, and I learned it real good. The scariest case I ever took on was when a woman in her 40s gave me a ring and told me she reckoned her husband bought it for a bit on the side. Those kinds of jobs are my bread and butter, so off I popped following this bloke around, trying to catch him out with his bit of crumpet while the wife's at home bathing the kids or something. About a week goes by, and no matter how much I follow this guy around, he never seemed to do anything too dodgy or go anywhere remotely naughty. Actually, I was getting a bit frustrated when one afternoon after he finished work, he started driving out to the middle of bloody nowhere. All I could think was, "I've got him now, don't I?" His one bit of unusual behavior, traveling out of town. This has got to be it. Only he didn't go out to some bloody travel lodge or something. He went right out to the beach, into this little boathouse hidden amongst some sand dunes. I'm thinking to myself, what the hell kind of place is this? What kind of bloke meets his bit of skirt in a place like this either? Either way, I grab my camera and start sneaking down toward the shack to get a picture of the two in action. I'm right up on the door, edging it open, getting ready to snap a shot of this fellow's pale, hairy bottom going up and down like the clappers, when I feel something cold and metallic push against the back of my head. "You the police?" someone asked. If I'd have said yes, there's no doubt in my mind that my brains would be splattered all over the inside of that boathouse, because what felt like a piece of pipe was actually a single-barrel 12-gauge, a proper old farmer's blunderbuss. I said, "No, I'm not. I'm a private eye investigating things, just shagging about." There was silence for a moment. Then he poked me in the back of the head with the barrel so hard it hurt. "Get in the shack now." I go in and see there's all these black plastic packages in the hull of a small rowing boat. Drugs had to be the only reason he'd be willing to kill a copper. That big boy money, so to speak. The fella held me at gunpoint, made me strip down, went through all of my stuff, making sure I was who I said I was. He was only satisfied when he saw my business card. He asked me again why I was following him, and I told him honestly, "The missus reckons you're shagging about." Good God, my voice was quaking like you wouldn't believe. He took the gun off me and laughed to himself. Here's what's gonna happen, okay? You're gonna take this $5,000 off me, go back to my missus and tell her I'm not having an affair. You tell her I take long walks on the beach. Tell her I'm going bird watching or something. You don't tell her the truth. Got it? He kept one of my business cards to let me know he was deadly serious. You do any messing about, and there's people I work with that will come find you. I knew he was being deadly serious. Needless to say, getting paid twice for one job was great stuff. But thinking I was about to get my head blown off by a secret drug dealer in a hidden beachside boating hut, I can't say I'd recommend it, to be honest. This happened at the end of summer in 2019. I, female, needed a distraction from my boring university revisions, and as lots of bored single people do, I hopped on Tinder. Nothing too serious, really. I was too busy to meet guys anyway. I simply liked talking to people. One day, I matched with a guy who I'll name Ted, who was in the same university as I was. He looked very handsome in his pictures. After talking for a few days on the app, and after I had wrongfully decided he was not a criminal, oh, the irony, I gave him my number. Again, we talked for a while, then he asked to call me. Nothing too exciting, just the usual getting to know each other. We talked on the phone for a couple of weeks. He called me at random hours of the day and almost every night. I didn't really think that much of it though. During our phone calls, he mostly talked about himself. I didn't really mind though because I didn't like talking much about me. It takes time before I trust anyone, and again, I was bored and a bit lonely. I'd been single for a while, so getting the attention felt quite nice. After a few weeks, Ted asked if I wanted to meet. I said yes because I'd finished with my exams. We met at the city center. When I saw him, I was kind of shocked. He looked nothing like the handsome guy in his pictures. It was definitely still him, you could tell, but good angles and Photoshop truly do make miracles is all I can say. I was a bit taken aback, but I'm not one to judge by looks anyway, so I went on with the date. Thinking back now though, there were some obvious red flags I missed. He kept asking weird questions like, "Are you shy? Why won't you stare into my eyes?" Well, buddy, non-stop eye contact is really weird. I do need to take my eyes off you to pick up my beer from the table or light up a cigarette sometimes. The night went on and we'd had quite a few drinks. Usually, I would never ask someone I just met to come home with me, but I was wearing beer mojito vodka goggles that made my brain blind. We left and spent the night together. In the morning, I drove him to the train station and went back home to have a nap. At the end of the day, he called me and asked if we could meet again the next night. I wasn't really sure if I wanted to see him again though. I knew the only reason I'd brought him home was alcohol in the first place. We didn't really click at all on the date. The idea of rejecting him made me feel guilty though, so I agreed anyway. The day after that, he came to my place again. And there, things started to get weird. I started to feel extremely nervous. Something was feeling really off. Thinking back, I think it was probably my guts telling me to get away from this guy. I decided to make things clear. I told him I was not looking for a serious relationship at all, at least not with him. I apologized and decided to bring him home. When we got in the car, he was quite angry. He didn't talk to me and I was embarrassed, so I didn't talk either. We arrived, he got out and slammed the car door quite hard. I knew I'd made quite a few mistakes here. I shouldn't have accepted another date with him knowing I was not into him, and I should have told him sooner I didn't want a relationship. I sincerely did not mean to act so badly. That's why I tried to be honest with him as I could. The next day, I called him and apologized again. He said it was fine and we hung up. I thought that would be it, but oh boy was that not. A few days later, it was time to get back to uni. That morning, I woke up to this gigantic message from him, telling me that the reaction I had a few nights before really threw him off, and he was looking for stability. As soon as I opened the text, he called me. It was 7 in the morning and I'd just woken up, so I couldn't really understand what he was saying. I simply told him again I didn't want to go any further with our relationship. He hung up, and for the next few weeks, things got even weirder. He started following me everywhere on campus. very obviously hiding behind walls to hear my conversations, texting me all hours of the day, even if I was not replying. Calling me 20 times a day even. I thought he was creepy, but that maybe he was hurt and was just coping. Ted was always with a guy we'll call Elliot as well. When I was at the library, they were always sitting together near to where I was. Ted was always watching me as I would study. When I went out for a break, he would follow me. It came to the point where my friends were texting me to warn me he was right behind me. I tried avoiding him, but it was useless. I told him many times I did not want any more contact with him, and he was making me uncomfortable, but nothing worked. He just kept going on, and I was going crazy. 2 weeks later, I was at a party where I met my now boyfriend. I fell in love very quickly. He's the most caring, loving man I've ever met. It's all lovey-dovey, yes, try not to puke on your keyboard. Anyway, in that moment, I knew I needed to put my foot down and stop being so acceptant of Ted's behavior. I explained to him one last time to stop contacting me, and finally blocked him. I truly thought it would be over now. He continued to follow me everywhere on campus though, except he was not with Elliot anymore. One day I was studying in the library. Ted was a few tables away from me, of course, when suddenly someone sat at the table in front of mine. It was Elliot. I looked at Ted and he was glaring at Elliot with the most murderous gaze ever. I thought it was weird. I had never spoken to Elliot before, and he never came near me at all either. I was creeped out. I thought maybe Ted had sent him to talk to me or something. But instead, Elliot just ignored me and I kept on studying. When I went outside for a cigarette, he also blocked Ted from following me. I was a bit surprised, but I didn't think much of it. A few moments later, Ted went outside. Elliot turned his head and watched him till he was out of sight. Then he turned to me and spoke in a hurry. "Hey, I really need to talk to you, okay? I think you're in some danger. I'm sorry, I know it's weird because we don't really know each other, but I'm really worried for you." I was stunned. I didn't know what to say. "We don't have a lot of time before he comes back. When you went out, he came yelling at me because I sat in front of you. When he leaves, we need to talk some more, okay?" I said yes, and I was shaking. At around 6 p.m., Ted finally left after watching me the whole day. We waited another hour to make sure he was gone. We didn't want him to know we were in contact with each other. At 7 p.m., we sat down in the cafeteria, and Elliot told me things that made me shiver. He explained that Ted had had really horrible discourses about women and how he would love to control them. He also explained that a few weeks prior, he'd started to have suspicions about Ted's behavior regarding university classes. He followed random classes every week, sometimes even showed up at Elliot's classes, although he did not follow them, and he didn't seem to have access to the university online platforms either. Elliot did a bit more digging and realized that his friend did not have a university email address, which every member of the university was supposed to have. Elliot went to the administration, and they confirmed what he'd suspected. Ted was not a student. He never was. After that, Elliot completely cut off contact with him. Since then, Ted was harassing him, calling and texting him all the time, following him everywhere. Elliot was shaking as he was telling me this story. I was shaken up as well. But what was coming would reveal itself to be even worse. Elliot explained he absolutely needed to warn me, because Ted had started saying some really terrifying things about me specifically. I wanted to cry. Ted was talking about me all the time. Shortly before Elliot cut contact, it got to the point where Ted was making very detailed plans about how he was going to rear me. That he knew where I lived, that he could come whenever he wanted and get me by surprise. He even knew where I parked my car on campus, and he wanted to wait for me in the dark. He always said it with this joking tone, but Elliot got real freaked out. I had tears in my eyes. I knew Ted was a creep, but I could have never imagined it was that bad. At this point, we were near the end of the semester, but we still had a few weeks left. Elliot and I decided to take action because we didn't want to be terrified every time we were on campus. First things first, we contacted university security. Things were taken extremely seriously. One morning when I arrived, the walls were completely covered with posters with a campus emergency number. Elliot and I began constant contact with the chief of security, who was very concerned for our safety. They managed to catch Ted at the library and asked him not to come again. We also went to the police. I don't know the right term for it, but we didn't file a complaint exactly. The police added a note to his record so that if anything happened to us, the police would know what we were worried about in the first place. The officer seemed worried as well. I asked him why. He told me he wasn't allowed to say anything specific, but if I ever saw Ted outside of campus, I needed to call the police without hesitation. How reassuring was that? A few days later, I got a voicemail from Elliot. Told me that he knows things he was not supposed to know. Apparently Ted is mentally sick. He's regularly arrested and locked in mental hospitals. Drug addict, alcoholic, has violent tendencies, was already accused of attempted rape. He lived off invalidity insurance, which explains why he had so much time on his hands to come to university. I would have never guessed that when I met him initially. Later, I contacted one of my acquaintances who works closely with the police. They weren't supposed to, but they confirmed everything. Sent chills down my spine. After that, things calmed down. Ted was still somehow managing to skulk about campus, but he kept a low profile instead. He stopped following us. It was finally the end of the semester. I went away for a few weeks and never set a foot on the campus. I felt a bit relieved. When spring semester started, though, Ted was somehow still there, not following any longer, but always watching closely. I was so freaked out. Then, COVID hit, fortunately. Since then, all courses are online, and I've not seen Ted again. I don't know if he's still creeping on people or if he's now officially a student or what. When I think of him, I'm still shaky. I hope I never run into him again. So I'm not gonna lie, I sell weed. Because I have a car, sometimes I make deliveries for people who live a little bit further away. A couple of weeks ago, one of my homies needed a sack for himself and a friend of his. I've known this dude for 15 plus years now, so if he says his friend is cool, then I'm cool too. Setting up the sack he wanted and some supplies of my other strains for the buddy, I set out on the 30-minute drive to the south side of my city. Now, I'm not a small woman by any means. I'm 5'6" and weigh 200 pounds of thick muscle. I also carry a 380 on my hip at all times, so I'm not really someone people tend to mess about with. When I arrived at my homie's house, we had our introductions, smoked a blunt, and I started sharing my samples with the new guy. He seemed alright at first. He was polite, made eye contact, didn't fidget too much. My homie said he had to make a phone call and stepped outside. Sounded like he was having some sort of spat with his old lady. The friend and I sparked up the blunt again as we discussed pricing and such for the different buds. Then, out of nowhere, he said this. Do you know how dangerous it is for a woman to sell drugs? I stared at him blankly. What the fuck had possessed him to just randomly say that? I shrugged, not really knowing how to respond. Seems like it would be real easy for someone to rob you. And do some other things, too. His voice dripped with something I'd never heard before. Malice, perhaps? This dude was making me feel real nervous, making me cross my legs and drop my hand to my side. I started looking out the window, wondering where my friend was. Oh, he's gonna be a while now. She caught him cheating or something and now they're fighting about shit. So, how'd you get into this game? His words seemed genuine once more. The malice I sensed earlier had abated somewhat, so I answered him honestly. Kids, bills, usual story. I began to nervously tap my finger, waiting for my friend to come back in, when he reached out and grabbed a hold of my leg. Not in like the gentle caress you would do if you were making advances either, but a tight squeeze on my knee so tight, it made me gasp in pain and left heavy bruises. You know, I should just take you out back and leave you in the desert. No one would ever know. The dude was fucking threatening me now. Everyone thinks they'll act in a certain way in certain situations. I mean, hell, the whole reason I carry a gun is to protect myself. But I was suddenly frozen in a state of shock. Before either of us could say another thing, my friend threw open the door in a huff. A sigh of relief escaped my lips as the guy released his grip on my knee. I quickly ran to my feet, grabbing my bag and the samples from the table, murmuring about how I had to run. Without even making sure I'd gotten the money for the sack, I booked it to my truck. threw it in reverse, and sped out of there as fast as my truck would allow me. I sprayed rocks behind the tires as I peeled out of that gravel driveway. I haven't been back to see that friend since. I've been dodging his phone calls and visits. I don't need his money that bad. 15 plus years thrown away just because he had bad taste in other people. I used to take the commuter train to go to school. I went to a private school, and it was a bit far away from my home. Because of this, I'd walk down to the train station every day and take that on my way to school. I also had to take it on the way home, and then walk the rest of the way once I arrived at the station. School was over at around 3 p.m., and the school was thankfully located nearby the train station. I generally always enjoyed the ride home more so than the morning ride. In the morning, the train was always packed with people. I figured the majority of them were probably off going to work, but since I got off school long before rush hour time, plus the fact there were not many other students taking this particular train, it was usually largely empty on the way back. For the ride home, very often I would have the entire car all to myself. On this day, I was riding the train home from school as usual. I got on the train and found the car completely empty. The train cars themselves had these doors between them, which allowed passengers to move between the cars when the train was stationary. Although some brave passengers would go in between when the train was still moving, I'd never done so before myself. It looked so scary and precarious to walk between the cars while they were still in motion. Well, on this day, I was reading from my textbook when I heard one of the doors open very suddenly. Looking up, I immediately wished I hadn't. Standing there was a kid from my school who always bullied me. I'd never seen him on the train before, so I wondered why he was even here. I gulped and jerked my head down real quick, hoping he would not have seen me. Unfortunately, it seemed he had. He walked up to me and stood in the aisle right by my seat. I could feel him glaring at me as I kept praying that a conductor would come along soon. I didn't dare to meet his glare. I just kept looking down at my book. He then reached out with his hand underneath and slapped my book up into my face. This caused the book to fly up and hit me right in the nose before falling back down to the floor. Before I could say anything or even grab my book back up, he grabbed me and put me into a headlock. I struggled against him, but he was way too strong for me. He roughly pulled me over to the door between the cars. My stomach went cold when I thought about what he might do to me now. Opening the door, he put his foot in the way to prevent it from closing once again. He then took me and tried to push me down in between the cars. He was way stronger than me and easily pulled me across. Scared for my life though, I was able to muster up enough resistance in order to keep him from pushing me out any further. I guess there was also the argument in my mind that maybe he really wasn't trying to hurt me per se. Maybe he was just trying to scare me, so he wasn't using all of his strength. Regardless, I was completely terrified and bawling my eyes out. He was calling me names and laughing at me, all the while trying to push me into the space between the moving cars. He succeeded and pushed me closer to that space. Fortunately, you could just about stand on the very end of the car and not fall down in between. I wasn't completely in the danger zone yet. Then, though, he began to punch me in the stomach multiple times. After a few torturous minutes of beating, finally a conductor rushed into the car from the other side. He screamed at the bully, ran over to him, and pulled him off of me. He then pulled me out from between the cars, and I collapsed onto the floor. Fortunately, the conductor was much bigger than my bully, and was able to hold on to him and keep him from attacking me any further. This is the positive part of the story. The train stopped at the next stop, but the conductor did not open the doors right away. Instead, they made an announcement that the train would be delayed because of an incident. What they'd done was call the police and kept my bully from leaving the train until they arrived. Seeing that kid handcuffed and escorted off the train and into a police car was one of the most satisfying experiences of my young life. Looking back, I'm not sure I can say how much danger I was really in. I don't really know if I would have been able to fall between the cars if my bully wanted me to, but at that age, it was really terrifying. My friend Josh and I were hanging out one day. I think we were about 13 years old at the time. I remember this happening in late fall, because there were still a lot of leaves falling down from the trees. We had hopped a fence and followed some train tracks which went through a local forest. We liked walking on the rails and pretending we were tightrope walkers. Yeah, I know that sounds pretty lame, but we enjoyed it, even though we weren't supposed to play on the train tracks. We were absolutely safe though. I mean, there's no way we wouldn't know exactly when a train was coming. It would surely be loud, and we'd see it from far away as well. The forested area was not so thickened with trees that you couldn't see far down the tracks. We'd been hanging out, balancing and talking for a while, when we saw someone who was also walking on the tracks. He was a bit off in the distance and seemed to be walking towards us. I couldn't exactly tell how old he was, but we figured he was probably a teenager, probably a few years older than both me and Josh were. He was wearing jeans and a hoodie, and he had his hood up over his head. His hands were hidden in the front pocket of his hoodie, and he was looking down as he walked right in the middle of the train tracks. Now this really wasn't unusual on its own. We'd seen other people walking by the tracks while we were out before. It was probably just someone who wanted to be alone, or maybe someone who was out for a walk, and the train tracks were the best way to find their way back. Anyhow, the guy was still a bit away from us now. It was then, though, that we heard it. There was a train coming, and we heard it approaching from behind us. Josh and I looked back, seeing the train was at a very safe distance away behind us still. And the two of us jumped off the rail, and we walked a couple of yards away from the tracks. So the sound wouldn't deafen us. We looked over at the guy who was still walking towards us, but he didn't get off the track, or react at all even. I recall feeling very uneasy in that moment. Josh thought it was just a guy that was going to play a game of chicken with the train. That was an activity I'd always thought was dumb as hell. I screamed at the man that a train was coming, which in a way seemed somewhat pointless. There was no way he didn't hear the train, but he still didn't move at all. He just kept walking forward in the middle of the track, right in the direction of the train. As the train quickly passed us by, I began to run forward a bit. I was really scared that this guy wasn't moving at all. I screamed at him more, but there was no way he could even hear me over the sound of the train approaching now. The rest happened so fast that my brain had trouble processing it. It was like time slowed down as the guy looked up and directly into my eyes. I kept expecting him to jump out of the way of the train at the last minute, like it was some sort of action movie, but instead, the train hit him dead on, right in front of my eyes. He didn't even try to move. I immediately collapsed on the ground and started vomiting. Josh did too. I won't describe what we saw in full detail. It's too awful to even remember. The train stopped, of course. The policemen and the fire department rushed in as well. We waited there in case they needed to talk to us. Came to find out later that the guy was a student at a nearby high school. He left a suicide note to his parents and let the train hit him dead on. Words can never describe how awful that experience was. I had nightmares about it for years afterward. Often, in those very same nightmares, I would once again see him looking into my eyes. I would always feel his blood splashing over me, covering me completely, and then I would wake up screaming. This story is told from a woman's perspective. I work in the city and live out in the suburbs. To avoid traffic, I take the commuter train to and from work. It's economical, it saves time, and it's generally a pretty stress-free way of traveling. I say generally because once I had a very awful experience riding home from work. And to set the scene a little bit, this happened in the winter, so the sun was already down when I got off work at 5 p.m. In addition, it was snowing as well. I made it to the train station, only to find it was extremely crowded. I had to push my way onto the train and try to find a good seat. The cars were pretty filled up to the brim already, so I ended up sitting in the only open spot in the entire car. It was a bench seat, situated right next to this pretty big guy. When you ride trains, you get used to having to sit next to people, but even so, you can sometimes sit next to somebody who makes you feel really uncomfortable right away. This is what happened in this case. The man I was sitting next to was pretty damn huge, and he made me feel very uneasy. Even though the trains were crowded, the bench seats were still big enough to allow space between the two passengers sitting on them. This guy, though, kept on trying to press up against me. I kept my earbuds in order to keep him from trying to talk to me, but he was obviously not keeping to his side of the seat. As much as I tried to just ignore him, he made the entire ride extremely nerve-wracking for me. Several times even, I just wanted to get up and walk away, but the train was too crowded to even move. There were passengers standing in the aisle, and there wasn't any room at all. I did try to consider that perhaps he might not have been trying to do this on purpose. Maybe he didn't notice it happening. After all, he didn't have a lot of room either. The stop where I was supposed to get off at would soon arrive. I realized I'd have to get up then in order to make it out. As soon as we stopped, I hopped up and tried to force myself through the crowd of people. I made my way out to the doors as everyone began to leave, and I got off myself as well. With a bit of shock, I noticed that the man had also gotten off out of the doors from the next car down. There were a lot of people getting off at that particular stop, but then I noticed him staring directly at me. As he kept looking, he lit up a cigarette and just stood by the train station, watching me as I walked away. Most of the other passengers got into their cars and drove off. I was stuck walking the rest of the way home, though. I kept looking back over my shoulder, and for the longest time, he just stood there smoking his cigarette and watching me. Soon, the crowd dispersed, however. As soon as they did, he crushed out his cigarette and began to walk in my direction. He was moving very fast now. I sped up myself, now really worried. I checked back over my shoulder and was scared to see the man was now sprinting after me. I had no idea what he intended, but I knew this could be no good. The next part is pretty blurry. He must have caught up with me at some point, because I remember him tackling me. I recall getting hit and falling down to the sidewalk. I hit my head on the side of the curb and completely blacked out. Next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital with a concussion and quite a few lacerations. They said the guy had a knife on him, and he'd cut open my shirt pretty badly. He had run off, though, when a couple of senior citizens who were out taking a walk saw him in the middle of attacking me. They called the ambulance for me. The police never found the guy in the end either. We had no idea what he really intended, but I guess I could have guessed. Since the man was never caught, I was scared to death for the longest time. Whenever I went to work, whenever I walked down the street, whenever I rode the train, I was terrified of the smallest things. It took me a long time to be able to recover from that experience. This happened when I was 15, near Algonquin Park. My father and I were driving up to our cottage in the middle of winter. I always was so amazed at the beauty of the area and Muskoka, and had grown up enjoying the beauty of it every summer. Our cottage was on a large lake, about a 30-minute drive from the nearest town. There were probably thousands of cottages out on that lake. During summer, the lake and the town's population tripled. It was cottage country, so people would spend all summer enjoying the lake and warm nights around campfires with their family and friends. I spent pretty much every summer there growing up, and it still brings fond memories of sunshine and laughter and the sounds of motorboats out on the lake. But the winters were very different. The people that didn't live there all year round would venture back home to the city life, leaving the area almost completely deserted, with the cottages all boarded up for the winter. There were a few people who would still frequently come up every couple of months for a few days or so, but for the most part the lake was completely silent during the winters, and the town was only filled with locals. The beautiful pine trees were always covered in snow, making an eerie ambiance. Our cottage was situated on a dead-end road. There were about 20 other cottages on that road, with ours being somewhat right in the middle. The cottages were quite spaced out, however, with our closest neighbors being too far away to even see through the trees. My dad had needed to head up there to do some painting that my mom had been bugging him to do. It was at the end of February, and it was a long weekend. I tagged along so he wouldn't be alone, and we could spend some quality time together. It was about a 5-hour drive, but it turned out to be an 8-hour drive this time due to the heavy snow. It had gotten dark out quite early, and it was around midnight as we drove through the park. It was deadly quiet and pitch black except for the headlights of our car. We finally passed through with only about 30 minutes left to arrive to our destination. It had finally stopped snowing, and we were both just eager to get there. As we turned down a familiar road, I remember my dad cursing a storm. It hadn't been plowed yet. This wasn't surprising, however. It probably wouldn't even be until later the next day that we would even see a snowplow. As we drove down the snowy road, we noticed there seemed to be a fresh set of tire tracks. "The Smiths must be up for the weekend," my dad said. All of a sudden, though, as we drove around the bend following the tire tracks, the headlights of the car shone on a white van that was parked on the side of the road. It was almost completely hidden by the vast trees that were covered in snow, hiding in the darkness. "What the?" my dad mumbled. As we drove past this van, I remember looking back through the back window and very clearly seeing 2 figures in the front seat, illuminated by our retreating taillights. As I told my dad this, he simply shrugged. "I don't know, maybe they're lost or something." I nodded, but I couldn't help but think about how this was a dead-end road, so why would they feel the need to park there of all places? As we pulled into our driveway and started bringing in all our stuff, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right here. I couldn't stop thinking about that van. Why was it there with 2 people just sitting in the dark in the middle of a snowing night? It spooked me so much that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him. I didn't want to sleep alone downstairs in the room my sister and I usually shared. It had big windows with no blinds that looked out into the blackness of the forest. My 15-year-old self was already scared enough of the dark. I didn't need to see the white van creeping around. It wasn't a big deal when my sister was there, but not alone, and not tonight. As my dad got ready for bed, I sat in the living room reading a book. My dad had turned all the lights off already, so I was using a small lamp next to the couch to try and get through one last chapter before bed. It was so quiet I could almost hear my own ears ringing. Suddenly, I started to get the feeling that I was now being watched. The living room also had large windows with no curtains that overlooked the lake. It was completely black outside, except for a single light from some cottages across the lake. I shut off the lamp and got up. Now, the cottage was completely dark. The moon was shining brightly, illuminating the snow. It was quite a beautiful sight, actually. I walked toward the window a bit to get a better look. As I did so, movement caught the corner of my eye. I remember my heart dropping as I saw 2 figures down by the back porch, crouched below the window, barely hidden by the surrounding trees. I dropped to the floor and crawled toward the bedroom where my dad was sleeping, my heart in my throat. I couldn't be sure if they had seen me or not. I hurriedly woke my dad up, and by the time he got to the window, the 2 figures were long gone. Where I had seen the figures, though, were 2 sets of footprints in the snow, which led back around to the front of the cottage and back down the driveway. I begged my dad not to go outside. He double-checked the locks and turned on the porch lights, hopefully to scare the intruders off. My dad wasn't as freaked out as I was, but he still set the alarm before he headed back to bed. I was extremely freaked out, though. I lay there all night next to my dad, terrified I'd look out the window and see someone staring back at me. The next morning, we went outside and confirmed there were 2 sets of footprints leading from the road to behind our cottage, then back around to the front and back up the road. There were also tire marks that showed a vehicle had turned around and then gone back up to the main road. My dad guessed they were probably looking to break in and steal stuff, as it was in the middle of winter and not too many people were at the lake. Thing is though, these guys knew we were there. They would have seen our tire tracks leading up to the cottage and my dad's car parked up front. They would also have seen the lamp I'd turned on to read, or at least seen it go off. My dad didn't have an answer to that, and after much back and forth, he called the non-emergency line and reported it. Apparently, there had been some break-ins in the area, and some stuff had been stolen from some cottages that were boarded up for the winter. I still wonder to this day, though, why would they be interested in stealing from the only house that clearly had people still inside it? Background: I'm 24 and female, and live with a roommate who's 23 and female, in an apartment in the suburbs of ATL. As you may well know, ATL is super dangerous and crime-riddled right now, so we have a Ring People camera, perfect for apartments, and a digital lock on our door for safety. Now on to the actual story. About 3 months ago, this really sweet family from across the hall moved out, and we got ourselves a new neighbor. His name is David, and let's just say he's quite interesting. When we first saw him moving in, we were a bit taken aback by the sheer amount of stuff he was trying to shove into his one-bedroom apartment. All of it was anime merch and Star Wars memorabilia. Definitely gave me some hoarder vibes. But that's none of my business. When the moving trucks left and a few days had passed by, my roommate and I knocked on his door to give him a friendly welcome to the neighborhood gift basket with some baked goods, dog treats, and poop bags for his dog. There were some scented seasonal candles as well. Apparently, that was not the correct thing to do though. After that day, David started to get creepy. It started out innocent enough. He would come to the door whenever he heard me or my roommate coming or going and have a quick casual chat. He would also come over regularly to ask for salt or sugar or toilet paper or whatever. Sometimes he would ask if we could come over and watch his dog for a bit. But within the past 2 weeks, things really began to escalate. And 2 weeks ago, we were out pretty late partying at the bars near the Braves Stadium. We ended up getting home around 3 a.m., only to find David sitting at the top of the stairs waiting for us. He acted all upset, asked us where we'd been, and requested we tell him if we're planning to be out past midnight. I laughed in his face, and he called me a mindless Stacy. Still not sure what that means exactly. He asked for access to our Ring camera so he could make sure we were safe. We laughed at him again and went into our apartment. Here's the scary part though. When we checked the camera the next morning, we saw that he sat outside our apartment the entire time in front of our door for the rest of the night. When we saw that, we contacted the complex to let them know he was acting crazy. And they told us to contact the police, so we did just that. The police told us to contact them if he made any threats, but since we lived in a shared space, they couldn't do anything until he entered our apartment or threatened us in some way. I assume the complex said something to him at least, because he left us alone for the next 5 days or so. The next week, he really got out of control though, constantly lurking outside our apartment. My roommate had to start leaving for work an hour earlier just to not cross paths with him. I can't leave the apartment during the day because he's constantly just standing outside waiting for me. He leaves love letters on our door, on our cars, in our mailbox. Once, when I told him I wasn't interested, he told me he would kill me and then himself if I didn't go on a date with him. Of course, I didn't get that down in writing, so the police decided not to do shit. He put up a Ring doorbell of his own too, so we could track all of our movements. He'll leave these really creepy sexual notes when we're gone, and we'll find them in the most random places when we come back too. We just don't know what to do. I only ever picked up a hitchhiker once in my entire life. but that one time was so absolutely bad, I would never consider doing it again. Hell, if I saw a one-legged war veteran walking naked in the snow trying to hitchhike, I still would not pick them up. That's how frightening this experience was for me. I was making a cross-country drive back in the 1990s. My family lived in the East, and I was living in California. I didn't really care for flying myself, so whenever I went home, I simply enjoyed a nice trip from California to Pennsylvania in my car. It was a good 4 to 5 day trip. On the second night, while I was driving through the desert at night, I noticed there was a man on the side of the road up in the distance. He was holding a cardboard sign and sitting off on the shoulder. I did think it was a bit odd to see that out in the desert, but I also immediately had some sympathy for the guy. Because of that, I stopped to pick him up. He seemed quite elated at first. He made a lot of small talk, and I asked him where I should be taking him. He said he wasn't going anywhere in particular, and if I could just take him to the next city, I could drop him off there and that would be just fine. After a short while, though, after things were settling down a bit, it was then that it began to get weird. He started saying things that really creeped me out. It began when he just said right out of the blue, "You know, you shouldn't pick up hitchhikers." I was surprised, but I asked him why he would say such a thing. After all, he was a hitchhiker who needed a ride. "Yeah, but you don't know anything about me," he responded. "You can run into some pretty crazy people out here." He paused for a moment, then laughed. I mean, personally, I'd never pick up a hitchhiker myself. I tried countering him by saying that he had no idea what kind of person the guy picking him up was either. He actually agreed with that, though. I tried to change the subject several times. I tried to ask him about why he was out here hitchhiking to begin with, but he didn't seem to really want to talk about it. After a while, he went back to talking about the dangers of hitchhiking. It was then that he said he had a question for me. He asked me, "So what would you do if I had a box cutter in my jacket, and I just sorta pulled it out on you, you know?" And the question freaked me out, of course, but I didn't really want to let that show. I simply responded that I'd probably do whatever he wanted me to. I didn't want to get hurt that night. The hitchhiker laughed a little. Then he changed the subject himself. He talked about other things. When we got to the next city, he told me I could drop him off at a hotel, and he could find himself a room quite easily. I agreed, ready to get him out as soon as possible. At that point, I was a bit upset. After the initial freakiness, I was so weirded out. We actually had a good conversation for the rest of the ride, though. I pulled up to the office of the hotel, told him goodbye, and he got out of the car before closing the door on his own. Before he did, though, he paused for a moment and reached into his pocket. He took out a box cutter and showed it to me, then grinned the freakiest grin I'd ever seen. "You're pretty lucky tonight, man," he told me. "I only like people who fight back." He closed the door. I sped out of there as quickly as possible, and I've never picked up a hitchhiker since. We've all heard the old adage that you should never pick up a hitchhiker. I remember even seeing a movie about it from the 1980s, called The Hitchhiker. It scared the crap out of me, and I swore I would never pick one up. I never have, but I did hitchhike on my own once. I was in college at the time. I'd like to say that this was a time when I was studying at the library or something like that, but of course I was not. I was at an off-campus party with some friends. It wasn't even off-campus really either. It was one town over. My friend Mike had given me a ride to the party. I was definitely drinking quite a lot that night and having a ball. Before I knew it, it was already 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, when I went looking for Mike, it turned out the damn bastard had met a girl 2 hours before and left on his own. I tried calling and texting him multiple times, but of course he was not answering. I tried to find someone else to drive me home as well, but either everyone was too drunk or they didn't want to leave the party yet. I had to get back to the dorms though really soon, because I had a lot of homework to do the next morning, or the next afternoon, or it would all be late. Not knowing what else to do, and not having enough money on me for a cab, I figured I'd just have to hoof it. If I got lucky, maybe Mike would get in touch with me while I was walking and come to pick me up on the way there. If not, it's not like I hadn't walked long distances in the past before. So, I set out. I was out for maybe 15 minutes or so when I saw the first strike of lightning in the sky. I groaned and tried to walk faster. I kept on hoping I could make it home before the rain fully started. I did not. About 10 minutes after I saw the first bolt of lightning, it began to lightly rain. It was then that a car came down the road. They pulled slightly ahead of me and onto the curb. When I walked by it, the guy inside offered me a ride. I wasn't sure at first. As I mentioned, I always thought hitchhiking was dangerous for either person involved. As I was mulling it over though, a loud crack of thunder changed my mind immediately. I hopped into the car, but soon after I wished I had not. The guy driving the car was extremely creepy. He kept giving me this weird-ass look, and didn't say much of anything either. I tried thanking him for giving me the ride, but he just continuously brushed me off and refused to respond to me. It almost seemed like he was uncomfortable with me even existing next to him. That made me begin to wonder why he'd even picked me up to begin with. When we were getting closer to the college campus, he asked me if I could grab something out of his glove compartment for him. I said sure. When I opened it though, I froze as I saw a large knife sitting right there. I asked him what exactly he needed from inside. He actually said to me, and I kid you not, "Could you hand me that knife, please? I'm gonna need it soon." I couldn't think of a single reason, or at least a single non-scary reason, that the man would need this knife while driving his car. I asked him what he would need such a thing for. At that very moment, he got extremely angry with me and began to yell and scream at me. "Just give me the damn knife!" When I hesitated, he leaned over me and reached for it himself while still driving. I was closer to the knife though, and now I was scared. I grabbed the knife myself and pointed it at the man. He reclined to his side of the car, and I demanded he stop right now and let me out. I could see in his eyes that he was furious. He did pull over though. As I was getting out, he again told me to give him back his knife. I basically told him to fuck off and get lost. I'd leave it on the side of the road for him later, and he could circle back and get it if he really wanted it. Of course he cursed me out. He did leave a while after. I did not leave the knife there. In fact, I threw it in the garbage when I got home. Last thing I needed was for him to come back for it and then chase me down with it. I walked the rest of the way back home in the rain, and it was a very miserable experience. A few winters back, I had a pretty horrible experience with a hitchhiker. I was out really late at night having attended a holiday party for work. While I was talking with a few people there, I noticed something that caught my eye out the window. It had started snowing while we were there. I hadn't exactly expected that to happen. I drive a Mustang which has a rear-wheel drive and doesn't necessarily handle very well in the snowy weather. I had to excuse myself from the party and drive on home early. Once I got on the road, the snow began falling heavily. The visibility was extremely bad. I had to drive very slowly to keep myself from skidding around as I was driving. A little bit further up the road, though, I noticed a figure in the light of a street lamp. It seemed to be a hitchhiker of some sort. My first impulse was to just drive right past him. The only thing I wanted in that moment was to get home ASAP. As I approached closer, though, I suddenly remembered when I was younger, and I used to go hitchhiking all the time. There were plenty of kind people in those days who picked me up and helped me out as well. Feeling a bit of sympathy, I pulled over and offered the man a ride. He was about the same size as me. I'm also a guy if you hadn't figured that out yet. The man seemed vastly underdressed for being out in this kind of snowy weather. He only had on a pair of regular jeans and a jean jacket, no gloves or anything like that. As I pulled my car back onto the road, I asked the man where he was off to. At first, he didn't answer me. He just sort of looked at me extremely strangely when I asked him. Then, when I asked him where I could take him, he responded very strangely. "Well, where are you going?" I wasn't exactly sure how to answer that. I was already regretting picking him up, and I simply told him I was on my way home. He replied, "Oh, where's home then?" I wasn't about to tell this complete stranger where I lived, especially not one who was acting as weird as he was. I lied to him and told him I lived somewhere else entirely than where I actually lived. I asked him again where he needed me to take him, and what he said next gives me goosebumps even today. "Oh yeah? Well, that's where I'm going too." He smiled at me. "What a coincidence, huh?" I was obviously startled at this point. I decided I would just drive him to where I thought I could safely let him out of the car, then drive off on my own. I drove him to the apartment complex I'd lied about living in. When I pulled in, I asked him which building he wanted me to drop him off at. He told me there was no need. "Just park where you normally park. I'll walk back to my place from there." I didn't know what this guy was up to, but I couldn't imagine it was going to be anything good. I figured I had to at least pretend to go along with it though, just to get him out of my car. I pulled into a parking spot and indicated the building I claimed to live in. I did have a plan to get away from the man, but the timing would have to be perfect in order for it to work. I opened the door and took a single step out of the car. He did too. I pretended like I was going to shut my door, but I didn't quite yet. When he shut his door behind him, I quickly hit the lock button, then jumped into my car and pulled the door closed. He turned around right away, clearly furious. It seemed my reservations about the man had been accurate. When he saw I'd locked him out, he started screaming and yelling at me. As I pulled out of the parking spot, he grabbed onto the passenger side view mirror and started pounding on my car as I pulled away from him. I made no attempt to try not to hit him, as I saw him take a knife out of his pocket and begin stabbing at my windows. He then ran it along the side of my car, scraping the hell out of it as I slowly drove away. Luckily, I got away with nothing but a very nasty and long cut on my paint job. It cost quite a bit to fix, but at least I got away without a cut on me. Before my mom married my dad, she dated a man named Craig. At first, he was sweet, but he slowly became abusive over time. My mom tried to leave multiple times, but Craig always threatened her. After one particularly violent argument, my mom waited and fled in the middle of the night. The years passed by, and she got married and had me. My dad's work included a lot of traveling, so it was mostly my mom and I at home alone in our big acreage home. I remember my mom was in the kitchen baking lasagna while I was sitting in my high chair. It was extremely hot that day, so she opened the kitchen door to let in some air. All of a sudden, she heard heavy footsteps enter the kitchen behind her. My excited mom assumed it was my dad returning and whipped around with a, "Hello, my love." Her excitement immediately turned to horror though. There was Craig, standing in the middle of our kitchen with a gun visibly tucked into his pants. Craig smiled at her and asked her what she was making. My mom mustered enough courage and told him she was making lasagna. She was physically shaking as Craig sat himself down beside me. He playfully pinched my cheek, and I remember laughing at him. My mom was holding back tears as she asked him what he was doing inside our house. Craig said he only wanted to visit my mom and he would leave after we were done eating. When the lasagna was ready, she served it to him. My mom took me and sat across from Craig so she could keep a better eye on him. He said he still had her things at his house and she was welcome to come by and get them soon. She told him she no longer needed any of it and he could simply throw it out. He started to get very agitated and said she'd thrown him away like garbage too. Craig said she was acting tough, but he knew deep down she was still the stupid little girl he had dated. He claimed my mom needed him in her life and that she couldn't function if he wasn't there to help her. He said he needed to be there to raise me because my dad was a slur who could never be able to protect my mom or I. He said if he really was crazy, he could have easily kidnapped us or done things to my mom right now because my dad was just a pussy who couldn't protect what was his. My mom started to cry and told Craig to leave right now. He said it wasn't her house anymore and he had every right to be there. My mom said if he didn't leave, she would call the police, which obviously made him angry. He threatened that if the cops got involved, he would hire people to cut her into pieces and film it as well. My mom started to cry even more. Craig then threw his plate and screamed at her to stop crying right now. I got scared and started to cry too, which caused Craig to stand up and approach my mom. She jumped out of her chair and cradled me in her arms. She begged for Craig to at least spare my life. He tried to reach over to touch my mom, but she got so scared she fell to the floor sobbing. At that exact moment, the phone began to ring. I guess Craig had become so overwhelmed or something that he just sprinted out of the house. The cops and his family found him about to shoot himself in the head after my mom called the police. His adult son had to convince him not to do it. My mom was so traumatized, she didn't want to deal with any of it. She simply got a restraining order against him. She and my dad moved across the country after. I got a bit curious recently and searched this guy up to see what he was doing. I was shocked to see he was dating a college-age girl who looked just like the woman he could never have. So this happened to me a couple of years ago, when my now husband and I were living in a townhouse in a pretty decent area. My husband was working third shift as a corrections officer at our local corrections facility, and I was working as a waitress/bartender. It was an unusually warm night for mid-March, so I took advantage and decided to take my husband's 80-pound Alaskan Malamute/Siberian Husky mixed dog on a quick walk around the neighborhood near our complex. We get to the end of the street that leads into the complex we live in. I noticed as the dog, Luke, stopped to relieve himself that there was a man across the street at the gas station with a case of beer in his hands. I had my phone out texting a friend and looked back up to notice the man was near the stop sign and seemed to be relieving himself upon it. I felt really awkward seeing this and instantly put my phone away. I hurriedly led Luke down the street on our path. At this point, I thought the guy must have noticed us. He crossed the street to where Luke and I had just been. Now I could hear him walking a few feet behind me. I just kept my head down. I pulled my phone back out and stared at it, with Luke glued to my hip. About 10 seconds later, though, I could hear the guy's steps getting faster. Luke realized the man was now behind us and stopped in his tracks. Mind you, he is a big dog compared to my 5'2" self. I can handle him easily enough, and he's very well trained by my husband. But I noticed his ears were perked up, and his tail was straight as well. I was glad he was aware of our surroundings. I wanted to keep moving, but I got this weird feeling. This guy finally caught up to us, so I tightened my grip on Luke's leash and pulled him closer to me. I stepped off into the grass to allow the man to pass us by and keep Luke out of his way. Did this guy keep going and pass though? No, of course not. When I thought he was about to go by us, I stuttered out a small apology because Luke was pulling on his leash to investigate the man. Most people were intimidated by him simply by his size. The man stopped and looked me up and down for a moment, long enough for me to smell the booze and cigarettes rolling off of him, and to notice he seemed to be in his mid to late 20s. Dark hair, scruffy looking, and extremely dirty. He smiled and seemed to notice Luke trying to get at him. Cute dog, what's his name? He proceeded to ask me if he could pet the dog. Before I could even give him an answer, he leaned down and grabbed Luke's face. Luke surely didn't like that. He jumped at him as a warning, and the man backed up chuckling. I apologized and mentioned he was very protective, and made up a lie he had been trained as my dad's former K-9 unit. Instantly, I saw the guy's face change. I don't know how to call it exactly. He asked me what my name was, and I gave him a fake name. He then asked if I lived around here, and I said I was visiting a friend of mine for the weekend. As soon as I finished saying this, he suddenly lunged toward me. I'm not lying when I say I've never heard my husband's dog growl in the 5 years I'd been with him. But the sound that came from my dog in that moment sounded like something from nightmares. Luke's hair was standing on end, and he was throwing himself on his back legs, kicking his front legs at the man. He was snapping at him as well. The man stumbled backward, nearly dropping his beer. "Alright, well, have a nice night then, cutie." He stumbled off down the road. When I say my heart was pounding, it was deafening. I grabbed Luke's leash so hard and sprinted between the buildings until I got back to my townhouse. I locked all the doors and collapsed by the front door. Luke was in my face the whole time, kissing me and whining. He is the sweetest and most gentle creature I've ever met, and seeing him growl and react the way he did made me realize I needed to get out of that situation and fast.